In 1933, an Ethiopian rabbi walking the streets of Harlem taught his young student a truth that modern science would only discover 80 years later. You are not a prisoner of who you are. You are a prisoner of where you direct your attention. In December 2025, neuroscientists had visualized more than 500,000 neural connections in the human brain reorganizing themselves. The resulting images were profound. The brain reshapes itself exactly where attention is focused. When you ignore a region, it freezes. When you nourish it, it transforms. The loops that force you to relive the same fears and the same stories over and over weaken by 15% when you stop feeding them. Cornell University. The old identity dies within the neural circuits. A new identity is born with a fluorescent green light. Abdullah knew this truth without a microscope. Neville Goddard taught it for decades. Science has reached the same map through a different path. The haunting question is simple. How many years have you lost feeding the wrong identity? In 1944, a man with no formal scientific training published a 50-page book claiming that consciousness reshapes the physical structure of the brain. 80 years later, Cornell neuroscientists are using advanced imaging technologies to capture how the brain physically restructures itself. This research is interpreted by some as echoing the process Goddard described. It is a problem few want to face. Neville Goddard was born in Barbados. He came to New York to study theater and, at age 24, met Abdullah, an Ethiopian rabbi who walked the streets of Harlem as if carrying secrets too ancient for the modern world. Abdullah accepted Goddard as a student and, for 5 years, transmitted a complete system to him: the Kabbalah, the interpretation of Hebrew mystical writings, and something he simply called the law. The law was precise. Imagination is not fantasy. It is, literally, a creative power. What you sustain in your mind with sufficient feeling becomes etched into the fabric of your being. The outer world is frozen consciousness. Change consciousness, and the world changes. Abdullah demonstrated this ruthlessly in 1933. Goddard wanted to visit his family in Barbados for Christmas, but had no money for the ship journey. When he told Abdullah, he expected sympathy or practical advice. Abdullah's reply was final: "You are in Barbados." Goddard protested. He was penniless in the New York cold, thousands of miles from the Caribbean. Abdullah slammed the door in his face. He literally refused to discuss the reality that Goddard insisted on seeing. In the following days, whenever Goddard mentioned his lack of money or the impossibility of the trip, Abdullah repeated the same phrase and ended the conversation. There was no room for negotiation. The command was absolute: live from the end. Sleep feeling the rocking of the ship. Feel the Caribbean sun on your skin. Hear your family welcoming you at the port. Experience Barbados internally with all your senses and emotions. Until Barbados becomes externally inevitable. Do not visualize from the outside like watching a movie. Feel it from the inside as someone who is already there. Goddard practiced. He fell asleep every night with the feeling of already being home. Weeks later, in a way he could never logically explain, a third-class ticket appeared. He spent Christmas with his family. When he returned to New York and told Abdullah, the rabbi was not surprised. To him, the result was certain from the moment Goddard began practicing correctly. The law works. It has always worked. The only variable is whether you apply it. Abdullah did not teach theory. He taught verifiable mechanics and demanded verification. What he taught only makes sense when you see the Cornell images. If you want to pursue this knowledge and reinvent yourself, don't forget to subscribe to the Sir Secret channel. Like the video and share your thoughts in the comments, because every piece of information shared here opens a door for your inner transformation. Now let's continue to see how science validates this ancient wisdom. In December 2025, Alex Kwan and his team did something no one had achieved before. They took the rabies virus, a deadly, efficient tool capable of crossing synapses like no other biological agent, and turned it into fluorescent ink. Every neuron the virus touched glowed green. Every connection became visible. For the first time in history, you could see the process as the brain reshaped itself. What they saw disturbed them. The brain does not reshape randomly. It reshapes where attention is focused. Neurons active during an experience build new bridges. Silent neurons remain completely untouched. It's as if the brain asks, "Where are you looking?" and then builds paths only in that direction. Kwan expected local changes, one region, maybe two. Instead, he found the entire brain reorganizing in response to a single principle. Attention drives structure, 500,000 connections obeying the same law. Abdullah had told Goddard this literally in 1933. Saying "you are in Barbados" meant your attention was creating your neural architecture. Stop feeding the reality you don't want. Feed only the one you do. The brain, and eventually the world, will follow. Thinkers call this direct gnosis, knowledge that does not come from external instruments. You don't read about how the mind works. You see it working from the inside, from the perspective of the one operating the mechanism, not someone taking a photo from the outside. Abdullah saw it. He passed it to Goddard through relentless instruction and practical demonstration. Goddard absorbed it, tested it, verified it in his own experience, and spent the rest of his life teaching it with a certainty we can only now validate. Cornell's science confirms the map Abdullah transmitted. Microscopes and contemplation reached the same territory through entirely different paths. Kwan used viruses and fluorescence. Abdullah used disciplined attention and the absolute refusal to feed unwanted reality. Both produced the same map. The difference is that Abdullah was the first to arrive there without any tools beyond trained consciousness. If this doesn't disturb you, you still haven't understood what it means. Goddard's central technique can be summarized in one sentence. Assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled. Do not just visualize what you want. Do not just repeat affirmations or send energy to the universe. Ask yourself, how would I feel if I already had what I desire? Feel that. Live in that emotional state as if it were your permanent residence. Sleep in it. Wake up in it. Let it become more familiar than your current situation. Goddard was specific about the mechanism. The subconscious does not distinguish between a lived experience and an experience imagined with sufficient intensity. If you can sustain the feeling that you have already achieved something, the subconscious accepts it as real and begins to reorganize your perception and behavior accordingly. You don't attract what you want, you transform into the person who naturally possesses what you want. The Cornell study photographed exactly this process occurring at the cellular level. When Kwan analyzed the 500,000 connections mapped by the fluorescent virus, a pattern emerged. Corticocortical connections, the loops connecting different areas of the cortex, weakened by 15%. Connections between the cortex and subcortical regions. The bridges linking thought to perception and action strengthened by 10%. In translation, the brain decreased internal chatter and increased contact with the world. The weakened areas were exactly those that sustain rumination. The voice that repeats your failures, the loop that relives an insult from 10 years ago, the circuit that imagines future disasters while you try to sleep. Fear, anxiety, traumatic memory, obsessive self-criticism. The study showed these connections lost structural strength. In an interview, Kwan said something revealing. Rumination is a key driver for depression, where people experience unhealthy focus and keep dwelling on the same negative thoughts. By reducing some of these feedback loops, our findings are consistent with the interpretation that psilocybin can restructure the brain to break or at least weaken this cycle. Neuroscience was describing what Goddard called dying to the old identity. In Goddard's language, the old identity is the one built through repetition. It is who you think you are based on what has happened. It is the narrative you tell about yourself, usually a narrative of limitation. I am this way because X happened. I can't because it's always been like this. This narrative lives in the corticocortical loops. It is the brain talking to itself. Memory feeds interpretation, interpretation feeds expectation, expectation feeds memory. A self-reinforcing closed circuit. Dying to the old identity means breaking this circuit. The areas that strengthened in the study were equally revealing. Vision, touch, movement, spatial orientation, everything related to direct perception and action in the now. The brain restructured for less contact with what was or what might be, and more contact with what is. This is exactly what Goddard's technique produces. When you assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, You step out of the narrative about your life and enter the sensory experience of a different life. You don't think about how nice it would be to have it. You feel what it is like to have it. The weight in your hands, the scent in the air, the texture under your fingers. You engage the same sensory circuits that would activate if the experience were physical. Because the brain cannot distinguish between vivid imagination and external reality, it reshapes accordingly. This strikes me every time I think about it. We build our identity through mental repetition. We repeat the same stories about who we are, what we can do, and what we deserve. Every repetition strengthens the circuit. Every strengthening makes the next repetition easier. Soon, identity seems solid as stone, but it is merely a habituated pattern of activation. The Cornell study shows this pattern can be shattered. A 15% weakening in ruminative loops, a 10% strengthening in sensory connections. The brain is literally forgetting the old identity while learning the new one. Researchers used psilocybin as a catalyst. Goddard used the state between wakefulness and sleep, SATs. Different tools for the same process, the death of the old, the birth of the new. But here is the detail neuroscientists haven't fully grasped. They see the process as something happening to the brain. Goddard saw it as something consciousness intentionally does. The difference is vital. In the scientific model, you are passive. In Goddard's model, you are active. You choose which identity to feed and which to leave to starve. Choosing where to place your attention is choosing who you will become. The loops you feed grow stronger. The ones you ignore atrophy. The brain is plastic, moldable, and constantly being rebuilt in response to what you do with your consciousness. 500,000 fluorescent connections prove it. How many times today did you repeat the same limiting story about yourself? And how many times did you cultivate the feeling of being the person you want to be? The ratio between these two activities determines the direction of your neural restructuring. The most revealing moment in the Cornell study wasn't in the 500,000 connections that changed. It was in the region that didn't. Researchers did something ingenious. They chemically silenced a specific region of the brain during the session. While the rest of the brain underwent the transformative experience, they inhibited neural activity in that specific area. When the fluorescent virus later mapped the reorganization, one thing was immediately clear. The silenced region did not reshape. Zero change. It was as if the experience never happened there. All other areas that were active, participating, and processing the experience showed significant restructuring. New bridges, new patterns, new architecture. But the chemically dormant region remained exactly as it was before. This validates what Goddard taught as the fundamental law. You become what you attend to. Not what you desire, not what you think you deserve, not what you plan for the future, but what you actually pay attention to, moment by moment, day by day. Where your consciousness is absent, nothing changes. Goddard called this the law of assumption. The reality you experience is determined by the state you assume. If you assume being poor, all your perceptions, interpretations, and actions organize around that assumption. If you assume being wealthy, reorganization happens around that new assumption. The silencing experiment proves the mechanism. Attention is not just psychological focus, it is a neural restructuring command. Every time you direct consciousness towards something, you are telling the brain, build here. Every time you withdraw consciousness, you are saying, leave this as it is. The brain obeys. It does not question. It does not judge. It simply reshapes where attention commands. Kwan was struck by the precision of the process. The probability of this pattern of plasticity determining activity occurring by chance is less than 0.006%. 1 in thousands. The brain doesn't reshape randomly. There is an organized intelligence directing every new connection based on where consciousness is focused. Goddard taught a technique called revision that applies this principle directly to the past. The method is specific. Before sleep, mentally revisit the events of the day, but reimagine them as you wish they had happened. A difficult conversation ends in harmony. A failure becomes a success. An insult becomes a compliment. Crucial detail, you don't watch the revised scene as an outside spectator. You relive it as an internal participant. You feel the emotions of the revised version. You hear the words you wanted to hear. You sensorially experience the different outcome. The revised scene must have the same vividness, or more, than the original memory. Goddard was clear. This is not denying what happened. It is withdrawing emotional energy from the version that imprisons you and transferring it to the version that liberates you. You aren't deleting the file, you are opening a different one until the old one stops being accessed. The Cornell study illuminates why this works. The hippocampus, the brain region responsible for consolidating memories, showed a significant weakening of its connections during the expanded state. The very region that stores your past defines who you are and keeps every pain and learned limitation alive, lost structural strength. When you practice revision, you are intentionally doing something similar. You withdraw attention from the original version of memory and place it on the revised version. The ignored version weakens structurally. The nourished version strengthens. You aren't lying about the past. You are choosing which version of the past will continue to shape your present. The past you carry is not what happened. It is what you mentally repeat about what happened. Every time you relive a painful memory, you strengthen the neural connection that sustains it. Every time you tell the same story of victimhood, you build wider roads to that destination. And every time you practice revision, reimagining the past with new meaning, you redirect neural traffic to different routes. The silenced region in the Cornell experiment remained unchanged. No new connections, no growth, no transformation. You freeze what you ignore. You preserve what you ignore as it is. You strengthen what you feed with attention. You make dominant what you feed with repeated attention. The question this raises is uncomfortable to answer honestly. Where have you put most of your attention in the last month? On the person you want to be, or the person you are afraid of remaining? Goddard had a name for the exact moment transformation occurs. The state akin to sleep, say TS. Not sleep, not full wakefulness, the threshold between the two. Those minutes when you lie down, relaxed, conscious, but the mind loosens its grip. The body gets heavy, thoughts float. The boundary between you and the world becomes less defined. Goddard taught this as the moment of maximum receptivity. The conscious mind, with its judgments, its objections, and its lists of why something is impossible, lowers its guard. The subconscious is exposed, and what you etch into it during this state has disproportionate power to shape your experience. The instruction was final. Lie down. Relax completely. When you feel your body sinking and thoughts beginning to dissolve, bring to mind a scene that represents your wish being fulfilled. Do not visualize it like a movie. Enter the scene. Feel it from the inside. See through your own eyes. Touch surfaces. Hear sounds. Let the feeling of having already achieved it saturate your body, and then fall asleep in that state. The scene should be short, a single moment representing the fulfillment, not the journey there. It's as if it has already happened. You are reliving a memory from the future. It sounds like a mystical technique, but the Cornell study reveals it is a precise neurological intervention. Kwan documented something specific about the default mode network, DMN, during expanded states of consciousness, the cluster of brain regions active when you aren't focused on anything external. The DMN is responsible for mental wandering, self-referential thought, and maintaining the narrative of who you are. During the experience, this network loses the dominant control it normally exerts. This means the internal voice, the one saying, "This will never work, who do you think you are? Remember what happened last time," is temporarily silenced. The habitual thought loops defining your identity lose power. Mental space normally occupied by self-preservation becomes available for other activities, like etching a new identity. Kwan was surprised by the scale. "This is really looking at brain-wide changes," he said. "It's a scale we haven't studied before. Usually we focus on a small part of a neural circuit. The entire brain participates in the transformation." Hermeticists taught something like this 3,000 years before neuroscience existed. The first Hermetic principle, the principle of mentalism, establishes that the all is mind. The reality we experience is mental in its fundamental nature. Consciousness is not a byproduct of matter. Matter is an expression of consciousness. What appears as a solid physical world is, At its most basic level, a sustained mental pattern. This seems abstract until you see neurons literally reorganizing in response to states of consciousness. The Cornell study photographed what the Hermeticists described philosophically. Mind is not just inside the brain, mind shapes the brain. Every sustained thought is a construction order. Every sustained emotional state is a remodeling command. The physical structure of the organ you use to think is constantly being shaped by the act of thinking. Consciousness precedes structure, not the other way around. Goddard understood this through direct experience. Abdullah transmitted this knowledge through oral traditions reaching back to lost sources. Hermeticists coded it in principles spanning millennia. And now Cornell researchers, without realizing they were validating ancient wisdom, photographed the same process in real time. SATS works because it takes advantage of a moment of neural vulnerability. When the default mode network loosens its grip, when the habitual self-narrative is dropped, and the brain enters a state of high plasticity, that is the moment when new impressions have maximum permanence. It's not magic, it's timing. When you practice SATS, you aren't doing anything supernatural. You are taking advantage of a neurological window of opportunity that exists every night just before sleep. Most people pass through this window thinking about the day's problems, reliving frustrations, or rehearsing future anxieties. They etch more of the same. Goddard taught the intentional use of this window. Choosing what to etch, choosing the scene that represents the person you want to be, saturating yourself with the feeling of already being that person and letting the brain do the rest. The window exists. Plasticity is real. The only question is, what are you etching as you pass through it? The portal between worlds, between what you are and what you could be, opens every night. Most people don't even realize they are passing through it. They pass through unconsciously, carrying the same old baggage to the same old destination. Knowing the portal exists changes everything. You can choose what to take to the other side. In the fluorescent images, one pattern deserves special attention. Neurons responsible for turning intent into movement and thought into action strengthened. Their connections gained density. The paths from the mind to the world widened. Conversely, the neurons responsible for internal chatter and rumination weakened. The paths that keep the mind circling within itself narrowed. Action strengthened, rumination weakened. Kwan commented on the therapeutic implications. This opens many possibilities for therapeutics. Perhaps how you avoid some of the negative plasticity and then specifically enhance the positive ones. He was speaking in clinical terms, but he was describing a process alchemists and mystics have documented for centuries. Alchemical tradition speaks of solve et coagula, dissolve and rebuild. Destroy the old form so the new one can emerge. Lead must stop being lead before it can become gold. Death is the condition for rebirth. The Cornell images show solve et coagula happening in the neurons. Cortico-cortical connections are dissolving. Cortico-subcortical connections are solidifying. The old pattern loses matter while the new one gains it. The fluorescent green marks exactly where the dissolution is happening and where the reconstruction is emerging. Goddard used biblical language for the same process. You cannot serve two masters. You cannot maintain the old identity and build the new one at the same time. Attention given to one is attention withdrawn from the other. Every moment spent reinforcing who you were is a moment not spent building who you want to be. Two masters compete for the same resource, your consciousness. Withdrawing attention from one state and placing it in another is dying to one and living for the other. These were Goddard's words decades before the technology existed to visualize the process. He described death and rebirth as an operation of attention reallocation. The Cornell study shows this reallocation has literal structural consequences. Cortico-cortical loops are, in neuroscientific language, the old identity. They are the circuits that trap you in repetitive patterns. The same anxiety, the same resentment, the same self-confirming limitation. These loops consume neural energy. They keep alive a version of you that perhaps should have died long ago. The 15% weakening in these connections is the death of the old identity caught on camera. The strengthening sensory-motor connections are the birth of the new identity. They are the circuits connecting you to the present world. Direct perception, action in the moment, contact with reality instead of chatter about reality. These circuits gain strength as the ruminative loops lose it. It's as if the brain is choosing where to invest limited resources. The 10% strengthening in these connections is the birth of the new identity captured in the image. The precision of the parallel is striking. Goddard didn't have a neuroscientific vocabulary. He used biblical terms and spiritual metaphors because those were the tools of his era. When you translate dying to the old identity into the language of neural connectivity, you arrive exactly at what the images show. When you translate being born as a new identity into synaptic restructuring patterns, you see exactly what the fluorescent virus mapped. Two languages describing the same phenomenon. Alchemists spoke of turning lead into gold, turning heavy, dense, limited consciousness into elevated, luminous, expanded consciousness. The laboratory was internal, the elements were mental states, and the furnace was sustained attention. Now we have photos of the furnace in operation. The process is profound. It touches the fundamental structure of what it means to be human. You are not a fixed entity observing a fixed world. You are a pattern constantly being rebuilt, and the tool of reconstruction is your own directed consciousness. Every time you choose where to put your attention, you are participating in neural alchemy. You are deciding which connections to feed and which to let wither. You are voting for which version of yourself will gain substance and which will dissolve. Mystics called this the great work. Neuroscientists call it activity-dependent plasticity. The names change, the process remains. The remaining question is personal. Which identity are you feeding? The old one, with its loops of limitation and rumination, or the new one, with its direct connection to the world and capacity for action? Both are currently competing inside your skull for the most precious resource you possess. You cannot serve both. The choice is made with every moment of attention, whether conscious or not. Quan said something that summarizes the whole discovery. It's like adding paths to the brain with psilocybin, but we didn't know where they were going. Now we can map every connection. For the first time in history, science has the exact blueprint of how a transformative experience reshapes the human brain. Every synapse mapped, every pattern of strengthening and weakening documented, every organizing principle identified. The map is complete. What Quan didn't realize is that this blueprint already existed. Goddard mapped the same territory 80 years ago through states where consciousness observed its own operation. Abdullah passed this knowledge to him. Abdullah got it from ancient traditions and lost sources. The lineage stretches back through time to thinkers who developed internal transformation technologies millennia before microscopes existed. We call it mysticism. Perhaps a more accurate name is contemplative neuroscience. The Cornell study confirms that by manipulating where attention is during an experience, you can control exactly how the brain reshapes itself. Researchers showed this by silencing specific regions. They showed that activity determines plasticity with a statistical certainty of 99.994%. The margin for error is almost non-existent. Goddard already taught the same technique through the conscious direction of consciousness. He said imagination acts as a bridge between the internal and external worlds. When you vividly imagine from within the desired experience with feeling, you are building that bridge. You are directing attention where you want the reshaping to occur. You are using consciousness as a neural sculptor. Every session of vivid imagination is a brain reshaping session. The difference between Goddard and the Cornell researchers is only the means of access. Quan uses psilocybin to induce a state of high plasticity. Goddard used sattva, the threshold between sleep and wakefulness, where the conscious mind loosens its control. Both access the same window. Both take advantage of the same moment when the brain is receptive to new impressions. The window is the same, the keys are different. Psilocybin forces the door, contemplation learns to pick the lock. Mystics developed methods to observe the process from the inside. They refined these methods over generations and coded what they learned in symbolic languages we can now translate into neuroscience. The knowledge was preserved, waiting for science to develop the eyes to see it. When Goddard said, "Assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled," he was saying, direct sustained attention to the neural pattern you want to strengthen. When he said, "Die to the old identity," he was saying, withdraw attention from the cortico-cortical loops that sustain your old pattern. When he said, "Live from the end," he was saying, repeatedly activate the sensory motor circuits associated with the desired outcome. It is a direct translation, same process, different languages. You have access to the same transformation technology Goddard used. The portal exists within you. It is available every night in the moment before sleep. It is available in any moment. You can deeply relax and direct attention with clarity. The technology was always there. What most people lack is systematic practice, the repetition that turns latent capacity into functional ability. Entering deep states of consciousness is a skill that develops with repetition. The first dive is shallow, the 10th goes deeper, the 100th accesses layers that seemed impossible at the start. Depth increases with practice. Mystics always knew this. Science confirms it. You are the laboratory. Your consciousness is the instrument. Directed attention is your procedure. And the results, neural restructuring, the dissolution of old patterns, the construction of a new identity, are available to anyone willing to practice with consistency. Goddard spent his life teaching the method. Abdullah spent 5 years passing it to him. Thinkers of all traditions developed practices that access this same window of plasticity. The information is available, the map is drawn. The decision to walk it is yours. The bridge between who you want to be and who you are now exists. The only question is whether you will cross it.